The ballroom shimmered with excess, a cathedral of velvet drapes and chandeliers dripping light onto rows of crystal glasses. Chicago's business elite gathered under one roof, their laughter softened by the muffled carpets and the hush of anticipation. This night was supposed to be a celebration of the product I had poured years of my life into. Douglas Reed, CEO of Stone Mount Technologies, stood at the podium as though he owned the city. His cufflinks flashed under the lights, his voice polished and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's raise a glass." Every face turned toward him. My name was not mentioned. Instead, with a smile that cut sharper than any blade, he said, "She never had what it takes." The room erupted polite laughter, trained applause, a sea of nodding heads that refused to see me. They clapped for my erasure, and for a moment the air tightened in my throat. I refused to let it choke me. I rose slowly, smoothing the hem of my blazer with steady hands. My colleagues' eyes widened, whispers rippling down the tables. I felt the envelope press against my palm, its weight more reassuring than any champagne flute. I walked the length of the ballroom, heels striking against marble, until I stood beside Reed at the podium. His smirk widened as though he believed I would beg for recognition. Instead, I lifted my glass and spoke evenly to Richard. From the company's biggest failure, a ripple of silence spread through the crowd. I laid the envelope down before him, deliberate, controlled, his brow furrowed as he tore it open. A beat later, the color drained from his face. The practiced charm fell away. "What the hell is this?" His voice cracked, raw and exposed. I didn't stay to watch. I didn't offer a speech or explanation. I turned on my heel, my stride unbroken, leaving behind the chandeliers, the velvet, the applause that no longer mattered. Behind me, the chaos swelled, voices clashing, Reed shouting, paper tearing. Ahead of me, the doors loomed, cool and quiet, and with each step, I carried the calm certainty that this night was only the beginning of something far larger than humiliation. As the heavy doors of the ballroom closed behind me, memories pressed in like an old ache. 12 years, more than a decade of my life, had been swallowed by Stone Mount Technologies. I had walked into that company in my late 20s, eager, sharp, convinced that hard work would carve out a future. Hard work became my identity. I was the one still at my desk when the cleaning crew arrived. I was the one rewriting reports at midnight, tinkering with prototypes when others had already left for long weekends on the lake. And slowly, without noticing, my life outside those walls began to erode. Birthdays slipped away. My daughter Emily once waited with candles burning on a cake that melted before I made it home. I told myself it was only one night, but one became many. She grew into her teenage years, learning to stop expecting me at the dinner table. The silence between us thickened until it was easier to stay late at work than face the quiet at home. My marriage followed the same slow decline. Promises to show up, to be present, to share more than exhaustion. Broken, one after another. The divorce papers arrived on a gray Tuesday. I signed them quickly, then stayed late at the lab as though more hours could cover the fracture in my chest. Yet I clung to the belief that loyalty had weight, that someone would notice. But when credit was handed out, it was men like Douglas Reed who stood at the front of the room, smiling for cameras, basking in applause for projects I had carried. My name rarely left their lips. I was the backbone they pretended didn't exist. And still, I endured. I told myself recognition was only a matter of time. I told myself Emily would understand one day. I told myself sacrifices eventually pay off. I was wrong. Walking out of the ballroom tonight, I finally understood the truth. Loyalty meant nothing to a man like Reed, and all the sacrifices I had stacked like bricks had been used only to build the pedestal he stood on. And when he replaced me, I knew the pedestal was beginning to crack. 3 weeks before that glittering night at the hotel, Reed called me into his office. His corner space was all glass and polished walnut, Chicago's skyline sprawling behind him as though it, too, bowed to his authority. He leaned back in his chair with that false warmth he saved for moments when he was about to take something from you. "Layla," he said smoothly, "you've been doing excellent work, truly. But this launch, well, it needs a younger face." At first, I thought I misheard him. Younger face. He continued as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "We're positioning this line as bold, energetic, disruptive. Optics matter. Investors like seeing fresh energy on stage." Then he said the name Jason Lowell, 26, straight out of a consulting firm. 6 months in our office. He had shiny hair, a bright smile, and an empty resume. A man I had trained on the most basic systems was about to stand where I should have been. I stared at Reed, waiting for the punchline, but his smile only widened. "You'll still be part of the team," he added, feigning sympathy. "But let Jason present. It's time we show a more dynamic leader. Dynamic, as if years of midnight revisions, crisis control, and innovation made me invisible the moment I turned 40. I left his office with my heart pounding in my ears. The betrayal wasn't loud, it was casual, brushed off like lint on his tailored suit. But that made it sting more. It wasn't just that I was being replaced. It was that I was disposable, erased in favor of a smile and youth. For days after, I moved through the office like a ghost, hearing Jason's voice rehearse presentations in the conference room, watching Reed clap him on the back. Every syllable was a reminder I had given everything, and in return, I was being written out of the story I had built. And in that silence, a thought began to form, not of surrender, but of resistance. The weeks that followed sharpened my awareness. Once the sting of being replaced dulled into something colder, I began to see the cracks that had been hiding in plain sight. It started with the test results. A thermal stress report on the battery units came back inconsistent numbers didn't line up with the lab's baseline. At first, I assumed a clerical error, but when I requested a rerun, the corrected file appeared almost too quickly. The data smoothed in ways real science never looked. Then came the expenses. Supplier invoices approved without signatures, travel receipts missing entire dates, bonuses logged against accounts that didn't belong to the department. On their own, small things. Together, they drew a shadow that no amount of bright investor slides could cover. I brought it up to Reed once, standing in his doorway with the papers in my hands. He didn't even glance at them. "You're overthinking. Layla, focus on the product. Let finance worry about the numbers." His tone was final, as if the very act of noticing made me the problem. But my instincts had carried me further than charm ever could. I knew better than to ignore them. So I began to collect, quietly, carefully. I saved duplicate copies of reports, forwarded certain emails to a private account, snapped photos of handwritten notes left behind in meeting rooms. Each piece felt small, insignificant, but stacked together. They formed a story no press release could erase. I told myself I wasn't seeking revenge. Not yet. But deep in my chest, a whisper kept rising one day. "You'll need this." Every late night I stayed at my desk. Every file I tucked into the folder on my encrypted drive steadied me against the humiliation that had begun to define my days. The company thought I was fading into irrelevance, but in truth, I was building a ledger, and the night Reed laughed at me from the podium, I knew exactly where that ledger would lead. By the end of 6 months, the folder on my encrypted drive had grown into something that no longer felt like insurance. It was a weapon. Page after page, email after email. Each one whispered the same truth: the company's foundation wasn't innovation. It was deception. I reviewed everything with meticulous care. Safety certifications that bore signatures from labs which, I later confirmed, had never conducted the tests. Investor decks with performance charts altered overnight. The sharp dips flattened into smooth lines of false confidence. Test results showing units overheating at dangerous thresholds quietly buried, replaced with doctored summaries. At my kitchen table, I spread the papers into piles. The evidence could fill a box, but I didn't need a box. What I needed was a single envelope with enough inside to detonate Reed's facade in the moment he felt most invincible. I slipped the most damning documents inside the falsified safety approval, a copy of the doctored investor deck, and 2 emails bearing his initials, authorizing the changes. Together, they painted a picture no one could ignore. That night, as I sealed the envelope, my phone buzzed. An unknown number lit the screen. "Stay in line. Don't do anything stupid." I stared at the message until the words blurred. My heart kicked against my ribs, but I forced my hands to stay steady. Fear was what they wanted. Silence was what they expected. I placed the envelope in my bag and carried it with me everywhere after that, its weight both terrifying and comforting. It wasn't just paper. It was proof. It was my voice, in ink and signatures, speaking when I no longer could. By the time the launch approached, I knew Reed's script. The smile, the toast, the cutting remark meant to dismiss me. He would think he'd buried me under his laughter, but I would be ready. And when the moment came, the envelope would be waiting in my hands. The night after the launch, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Calls stacked one on top of the other, HR demanding a discussion, legal leaving voicemails laced with polite threats, and Reed himself barking through the speaker, "Call me back, Layla. We can resolve this." I let them all go unanswered. Their urgency only confirmed what I already knew: the envelope had landed where it hurt most. By evening, a black SUV appeared across the street, its engine low and steady. It didn't move for an hour. Curtains drawn. I sat in the dark, listening to the faint hum. My pulse thudded, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. Eventually, the SUV rolled away, but the air it left behind felt colder than before. The next morning, footsteps echoed on my porch. I peered through the peephole and found Reed himself standing there, his tailored suit sharp against the faded paint of my front door. He didn't knock. Instead, he crouched, slid a thick envelope under the door, and spoke through clenched teeth. "This is my final offer. 7 years' salary. Immediate payout. All you need to do is sign and stay silent." His tone carried a calm that didn't match the tension in his jaw. I waited until his car pulled away before picking up the envelope. Inside was the contract numbers meant to dazzle, clauses meant to bury, a non-disclosure agreement as tight as a noose, promising comfort in exchange for erasure. I walked straight to the shredder, fed the papers in, and watched the teeth tear them to ribbons. The sound was louder than his voice had been in the ballroom, more satisfying than applause. "Comfort bought by silence isn't comfort at all," I whispered, sweeping the shredded strips into the bin. The phone rang again, vibrating against the countertop. I ignored it, pressing my hand against the envelope-shaped bulge, still safe in my bag. Reed thought money could buy my silence. He hadn't yet understood how dangerous I could be when silence was no longer for sale. After shredding Reed's offer, I knew I couldn't fight him alone. Silence had kept me invisible for years, but now silence would only get me crushed. I thought of Maya Patel, a colleague I hadn't spoken to in almost a decade. She'd left the industry when her conscience outweighed her paycheck, moving into consumer safety advocacy. I dug her number out of an old notebook, my fingers trembling as I dialed. When she answered, her voice was steady, as if she'd been expecting me all along. "Layla. Took you long enough." I told her everything in pieces, my throat tightening around the words. She didn't interrupt, just let the story spill. When I finished, there was a pause, then her reply, "You're not crazy, and you're not alone. I know 2 people you need to meet." 2 days later, I sat in a quiet office above a bookstore on the north side. Maya introduced me to Mark Halstead, a journalist for the Tribune with lines of weariness carved into his face, and Alicia Moreno, a litigation attorney whose calm eyes carried the weight of battles fought in courtrooms. Mark sifted through the copies I brought, his brows knitting as he read. These certifications, if they're falsified, we're not talking about minor infractions. This is criminal liability. Alicia closed her notebook and looked directly at me. "If you go forward, we'll file for whistleblower protection. But you need to understand Reed will come after you with everything he has. He'll try to paint you as disgruntled, unstable. You have to be ready." Her words should have scared me. Instead, I felt lighter than I had in months. For the first time, the weight wasn't all mine. We mapped out the plan in careful steps, regulators first, then press coverage once the evidence was secure, legal filings to protect me from retaliation. It wasn't victory. Not yet. But it was structure. It was hope. When I left the office, the city lights felt different. Not like walls closing in, but like signals guiding me forward. The first sign came in a thin envelope delivered by courier, a formal acknowledgement from the SEC. Hours later, another notice arrived from the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Both agencies had opened preliminary files based on the documents Maya and I submitted. By the next morning, Stone Mount received a litigation hold order, every email draft, and handwritten note related to testing was to be preserved. The effect was immediate. My inbox filled with forwarded memos, quiet notes from colleagues still inside the company. They're panicking. One message read, "Legal is telling everyone not to delete a single file." The walls were tightening around Reed, and I could feel him clawing at the corners. Mark's article landed 2 days later. Documents suggest safety concerns, ignored before launch. The headline was clinical, careful, but the impact rippled across the city. Investors called emergency meetings. Employees whispered in hallways, their once proud launch reduced to a question mark. Stone Mount stock dipped 3 points by closing bell. That night, my voicemail filled with Reed's voice, strained and furious. "You're destroying this company. Layla, you think you're a hero. You're nothing but a liability." Each message grew louder, more desperate. I didn't delete a single one. Instead, I transferred them to a secure drive, labeling them by date and time. Every angry syllable became part of the record he thought I was too weak to keep. Alicia called me after reading the article. "This is where it gets dangerous," she warned. "Cornered men make reckless moves. Keep your routines unpredictable. Don't meet anyone alone." I nodded, staring at the glowing screen of my phone as another call from Reed went unanswered. His rage was fuel, but it was also proof that the balance of power was shifting, that he felt something slipping from his grip he couldn't afford to lose. And I knew the pressure had only begun. The higher it rose, the closer we were to breaking open everything he had built. The glass walls of Stone Mount's headquarters gleamed like ice as I was escorted into the boardroom. Reporters crowded the hallway outside, their cameras clicking through the frosted doors. Inside, the air was brittle with tension. At the long table, the board members sat rigid. Attorneys lined the edges, and a court reporter's fingers hovered above the keys. Across from me, Reed waited, immaculate in his suit, but his eyes burned. "Let's be clear," he began, his voice sharp with practiced authority. "She's a disgruntled failure, nothing more. These claims are fabrications from someone bitter. She was passed over." I said nothing at first. I let the silence settle until the board's discomfort shifted toward him. Then I slid a folder across the polished wood. Inside the failed safety tests, unedited, with lab stamps, the doctored investor decks, versions side by side, and 2 emails bearing his initials authorizing the alterations. The court reporter's keys clicked steadily, preserving every movement, every word. One of the board members adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents. His lips pressed into a thin line. Another shifted uneasily in her chair. Reed leaned forward, his voice rising. "This doesn't prove anything. She's twisting context, cherry-picking data." I met his eyes, steady. "No. Richard, you destroyed this company when you buried safety. I just stopped you from burying the truth." The words hung in the air like a verdict. For a moment, even the reporters typing paused. The silence was heavier than shouting, heavier than denial. It pressed down on Reed until his jaw clenched, his knuckles whitening on the table. Across the room, I saw it, the first fracture in his armor. The board wasn't rallying behind him. They were pulling away, their silence more damning than my words. I gathered my papers with calm precision. This confrontation wasn't the end. It was only another step, and I knew there was still one card left to play. 1 week later, I sat beneath the sterile lights of a government chamber in downtown Chicago. The rows behind me were packed with reporters, investors, and regulators, their voices hushed but expectant. Cameras lined the back wall, live streaming the proceedings across the country. My palms rested on the folder in front of me, the weight of months condensed into a few sheets of paper. Reed entered like he always did, chin high, smile polished, suit impeccable. When the chair recognized him, his voice flowed with the same smooth confidence I'd heard in countless boardrooms. "These allegations," he declared, "are exaggerations from a disgruntled former employee. Nothing substantiated, nothing credible." He gestured toward me without even turning his head, as if swatting at an inconvenience. I waited, letting him spin his web of denial until the moment came. Slowly, deliberately. I opened my laptop. The screen flickered to life, and I turned it toward the panel. "Mr. Reed may call me bitter," I said, my voice steady, but perhaps he'd prefer to hear from someone else. The video connected. On the screen appeared Ethan Cross, a former engineer, his face partially obscured for protection. His voice, however, carried across the chamber with unmistakable clarity. "Douglas Reed instructed me, more than once, to alter safety data. He threatened my job if I refused. Those units were dangerous, and he knew it." Gasps filled the room. Camera shutters fired like a storm. The live stream's comment feed lit up in real time, racing across millions of screens. Reed's face drained of its practiced calm, his mouth opening but no words forming. Regulators at the panel leaned forward, their pens flying, their questions sharper now. I closed my laptop, gathered my folder, and rose. I didn't look back as I walked past the flashing cameras, the murmurs rising behind me. Outside, the winter air hit my face, crisp and clean. My phone buzzed nonstop in my pocket. "Thank you. You saved lives. You did what none of us could." Sometimes the loudest victory is silence walking away while the truth speaks louder than you ever could.